Okay, good morning, good morning, good morning. I'm thrilled to see everybody back. I appreciate your patience. Last spring was really busy for us. We had several programs. We had a fabulous trip down to Vegas for the NNSS trip. And I have to tell you, I've been working with our NNSS partners, and we're going to do a different type of trip this spring. It's going to be focused on global security and looking at programs out beyond the weapons program, looking over the horizon of other programs that they're doing to respond to the emerging threat environment. Also, we had a fabulously successful youth security forum. I'm going to give a big shout out and thank you to our members, of course, and our friends of the forum, who we wouldn't be able to do hardly anything in NSF without, and recognize our corporate sponsor, MSTS, who we're very grateful to have and who you'll be hearing a little more from. They are also our bridge to Southern Nevada. We have two upcoming events. Watch the website for the exact date. So one is going to be Professor Bert Tussing from the U.S. Army War College. He is really interested in talking about the strategy the U.S. military is looking at for the return of the state actor adversary. We've been in a period of time where the military did a lot of building its resources to deal with non-state actors. We have to keep that sustained. But now we've got China, Russia, Iran, other issues on the horizon. And he wants to talk about how the military is forming that strategy and what it also means to the homeland. And that'll be sometime in October. In November, we're going to be doing a very special program. We have invited General Audra Berry, who is the Adjutant General for the state of Nevada, to speak to us about what the transition looks like for veterans when they come out of the Guard, when they come out of active duty military, and what are the programs that are there to help veterans make that transition, and also what the impacts of the PTSD crisis has had on military readiness. Everybody ready to put on your nuclear hat and listen to what's happening in the threat world? We are very honored to have a panel. We have gotten our nuclear experts, Ray and Keith, back to talk to us to set the stage today for what the threat space, how it's changed, how it's evolved. And I intentionally chose the nuclear insecurity because things are heating up in the world of nuclear threat. Back when I worked in the Pentagon, we joked that we had the office of nuclear doesn't matter. Well, nuclear matters now. Ray is going to give you a little overview of where we are at the changing threat space. Keith is going to pull the thread from that and say, what are the policy options to counter that? Neile Miller from NNSS is then going to pivot. So it brings it back to Nevada. What is NNSS doing to position us to look over the horizon at the evolving threat environment? And then Tom Carey is going to talk about nuclear nonproliferation. We haven't talked about proliferation programs much in this context before. We've been concentrating on the weapons development program. So you'll get a look in as to what are some of the technical challenges that they face and what they're doing to respond to the threat environment. With that, Ray, I'm turning it over to you.
Well, good morning. My task is to survey some of the changes that I've seen take place in attitudes toward nuclear weapons and to suggest, at least to you, some of the reasons why I think the world is changing. Major changes to the nuclear threat environment have been unfolding for the past several years, due in large measure to the shock the Russian invasion of the Ukraine has had on geostrategic perceptions of world leaders. Before we trace these changes, let's take a quick look at the balance of nuclear arsenals. The first thing to note is that 88% of these weapons are possessed by the United States and Russia and include deployed, reserve, and retired warheads. For NATO and Russia, most of the warheads cited are strategic long-range systems. For other countries, most of the warheads are shorter range, although they are all developing strategic capabilities. China reportedly has 134 ICBMs, and India has 2. The attraction of nuclear weapons is to create a deterrent against invasion and to punish an aggressor should deterrence fail. The purpose is to create a nuclear sanctuary. There's also been the hope that by discouraging attacks on the sanctuary, adjacent areas and allies will enjoy the protection of a nuclear umbrella. For decades, this has worked. It broke down with the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. What happened? In 1994, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, when the world was concerned that unsecured nuclear weapons might fall into the hands of terrorists, major efforts were made by the largest nuclear powers to acquire, retire, and centralize the security control over existing warheads. Large numbers of strategic weapons had been deployed to the Ukraine during the Soviet era, and Ukraine was persuaded to give them up in exchange for guarantees of its security from three nuclear powers: Russia, the United States, and Britain. The perception was widely held that great power confrontations had ended and that there would never again be wars in Europe that rivaled the battles of World War II. National resources were directed away from the military budgets and toward civilian uses. Russian forces hollowed out, but so did the forces of NATO. One figure that comes to mind is that the German army had 3,000 battle tanks in 1994, but by the time of the Russian invasion, had only 300. In the meantime, the U.S. nagged NATO members constantly to meet their recommended 2% of GDP commitment to support their forces pledged to NATO. The Russian invasion of the Ukraine in February 2022 shattered the geostrategic illusion that a major war would never again threaten Europe. First, Ukraine was invaded with conventional forces by a nuclear power, which was one of its security guarantors. Second, the other two nuclear powers, concerned with escalation, came slowly to the rescue by providing conventional equipment and supplies, but not ground reinforcements. Ukraine had to defend itself with its own conventional forces. Finally, and most relevant to this discussion, none of the nuclear powers would fight each other directly. And at least for the first 2 years, equipment provided to the Ukraine had strings attached. It could be used against Russian forces, but not used against the Russian nuclear sanctuary. Despite vigorous Western support to the Ukraine, many countries took away lessons that have changed the geostrategic outlook. First is that the idea of a nuclear umbrella was a myth. A nuclear power with large conventional forces invading a smaller country without nuclear forces would not be dissuaded. Second, deterrence worked, but in a limited way. Nuclear powers would not fight each other directly. Thus, invasions of small allied non-nuclear countries might have to be fought without the reinforcement of combat forces on the ground. Thirdly, only a large and contiguous alliance like NATO, which can command massive and advanced conventional forces, is likely to forestall an attack. But if some non-nuclear country within the alliance is invaded, it might have to conduct its own defense until allied conventional forces arrive. I believe this puts into perspective why Sweden and Finland, after long histories of neutrality, rushed to join NATO. I think it helps to explain why 23 NATO countries are expected to meet or exceed their 2% contribution this year compared to 3 in 2014. It suggests why Germany will allow U.S. nuclear weapons to be stationed on its territory in 2026. And you may recall the Pershing uproar in Britain and Germany during the 80s. It helps to understand why countries like Pakistan and North Korea are trying to develop strategic nuclear weapons beyond the short-range weapons they already have. If conflict comes to them and involves superpowers besides their regional enemies, they want to be able to threaten those superpowers directly. Those targets as distant as the United States, China, and Russia. Moreover, it helps to see why Iran persists in its nuclear efforts, why South Korea is discussing the creation of its own nuclear sanctuary, and why Japan had brief discussions on changing its pacifist constitution. Now we turn to the consequences of these new perceptions and ask whether they have made the world more dangerous. My answer is yes, because they have made the use of short-range tactical nuclear weapons more likely. It used to be that only superpowers had nuclear weapons. times have changed. Because nuclear powers won't fight each other, and because nuclear weapons are proliferating, the use of tactical nuclear weapons is no longer seen as crossing a line which will lead to a doomsday superpower strategic exchange. If indeed they are used, we enter a new strategic world for which there is no established military doctrine, and how to control escalation is a mystery. Consider this. Russia has threatened the use of tactical nuclear weapons in the Ukraine. The military utility of such weapons is to destroy masses of troops as they gather to break through entrenched defenses, to destroy entrenched defenses to facilitate an offensive, or to destroy military stockpiles and logistics which support advancing troops. Thus far, there have been no situations in which the use of nuclear weapons would have improved the Russian military's position sufficiently to justify their use. But hypothetically, the current Ukrainian foray into Russian territory near Kursk, and you can see on this map that Kursk is in the upper right-hand corner of the map in Russia. The current foray near Kursk, or another like it, might succeed in taking and holding some significant objective. If Russia then used a tactical nuclear weapon within their own nuclear sanctuary, would Western supporters of the Ukraine respond with anything beyond editorials? Similarly, if a hypothetical Ukrainian breakthrough near Kherson, which is seen down in the lower center of the map, promised to divide and isolate a large number of Russian troops holding the eastern Ukraine, and it were neutralized by a tactical nuclear strike, a strike within the confines of a non-nuclear power, would the West escalate against Russia on behalf of the Ukraine? Also, hypothetically, if a North Korea possessing ICBMs and used tactical nuclear weapons against South Korean ports to forestall U.S. reinforcement, would the U.S. strike only at North Korean positions within South Korea, or alternatively strike within the North Korean sanctuary and accept the risk of retaliation? Currently, because of Gaza, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iran through its proxies have stepped up their attacks on Israel. Israel is reportedly considering its options against Hezbollah as well as Iran. Israel is a nuclear power, and Iran is not yet a nuclear power. How many strikes will Israel take on its territory before it attacks Tehran directly? And will any of Iran's allies respond directly against Israel? At its party Congress earlier this year, China altered its national priorities from economic growth to investments in its Navy, strategic nuclear forces, and conventional forces. Now, hypothetically, if China, with large and modernized forces, invades Taiwan 10 years from now, what options does the U.S. have to help? Attack only those Chinese forces already on Taiwan? And you might add, make it look like the rubble in the Ukraine? All of us hope that these and similar situations will never arise. But I believe that the fallacies of the past mindset that believed a nuclear deterrence could be extended to allies has given way to a new geostrategic outlook that has emboldened nuclear states with powerful conventional forces. It has not made international conflict more likely, but it has opened the door to the use of tactical nuclear weapons and has exposed us to the unknown.
Thank you, Ray. On that cheery note, we appreciate getting the threat perspective, but we don't want to leave it there.
Thanks, Ray, for an insightful presentation. Ray and I first met 50 years ago this month, and his division, the agency, was supporting the mutual balanced force reduction negotiations in Europe. And I was the new kid on the block. And when Henry Kissinger, as Secretary of State, decided our delegation to those negotiations was too big, I got a call Friday night, "You're not going to go." Oh, well, at least I had met Ray by that time. I have to say, I've tried to learn from him over the years and tried to match his careful analysis. So giving this disturbing picture that Ray has given to us, I want to share some thoughts and questions, because I have more questions than I have answers. How does this affect the U.S. nuclear strategy and posture in terms of its arsenal? Since World War II, nuclear weapons have essentially been a deterrent to prevent aggression. And this was most notable in Europe when we had the nuclear tripwires. So if the Soviets came across into Germany with overwhelming conventional force, we say, we'll nuke you. And that seemed to work. We also, as Ray said, we provided a nuclear umbrella to friends and allies, many of whom wanted to have their own nuclear deterrent. But we said, you don't need it. We got you covered. Well, how has that worked for Ukraine? And what kind of security guarantees can we give to Ukraine to perhaps end and to monitor the end of this current conflict? How well do you think Ukraine trusts the U.S.? Is the U.S. nuclear deterrent still effective? And is it credible? Are we willing to use our nuclear arsenal against other nuclear powers? As Ray mentioned, probably not. And which other countries, because our nuclear umbrella is no longer credible, want their own nuclear forces? Iran, clearly a threshold state, as we call it. Japan, incredibly, is even considering nuclear weapons, despite the tragedy that happened in 1945. South Korea has always talked about it, possibly. How about other European NATO countries like Germany and Saudi Arabia and Egypt? Why? Because they're Sunni Arabs and Shia Iranians about to get nuclear weapons. And the Pakistani Shias have a nuclear arsenal, but the Arab Sunnis do not. So there's strong motivation there. So to have an effective nuclear arsenal, to maintain one, is expensive and it requires modernization. And we are doing modernization. It's on the books, spending big bucks for our land-based missile systems, our heavy bombers, and our submarine-launched ballistic missiles. And a new sea-launched cruise missile, which is nuclear, which can be carried by submarines or surface ships. So what are some of the potential strategic nuclear conflicts that we're looking at? How large of an arsenal do we need to have a credible deterrent? Well, let's look and see what history shows. Until we started the SALT negotiations in 1969, we and the Soviets were at about 10,000 online deployed strategic nuclear weapons. That's a lot of weapons. By the 1990s, with START, we had reduced that to 6,000. In the 2000s, we reduced again by treaty to 3,500. And the last treaty, called the New START Treaty, we're down to 1,500 deployed. That doesn't count the reserve, doesn't count the retired. That's what's on missiles, that's what's in bombers to be used in conflict. But guess what? We realized during the Cold War, when we were at the 10,000 mark, that more weapons did not ensure more security. We didn't feel more comfortable. And when President Johnson and Premier Kosygin met in 1968 to launch what they hoped would be the SALT negotiations, both sides had come to the realization it doesn't make any more sense to spend more money to build larger arsenals because we're not more secure. So what are we looking at? A Russia-US confrontation, possibly if Ukraine is the cracker jack that makes that happen. How about China-US? You always hear about China-US conflict, particularly over Taiwan. And of course, Russia-NATO, again, because of potentially Ukraine. So what's our strategy for dealing with tactical nuclear exchanges? These short-range weapon systems that they seem tactical to us, but if you're in India and Pakistan, they're strategic. If you're in North Korea, South Korea, they're strategic. If they're Israel and Iran, they are strategic. Your existence is at stake. But we see them as tactical because they're short range. So what does that do for us? Well, Ray talked about that a little bit. So what about some of the potential conflicts with these weapons? Okay, Israel, Iran, India, Pakistan, India, China. Don't forget, India's primary reason for nuclear weapons is not Pakistan, it's China. It can take care of Pakistan with conventional forces. How about China, Taiwan, North Korea, South Korea? There's a lot of very itchy, red-hot spots out there that could get out of control very quickly and use these short-range nuclear weapon systems, as Ray had talked about. So how are we prepared to deal with it? Well, at the strategic level, we've worked for decades on SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, the thing that Ronald Reagan said, we're going to make nuclear weapons basically unnecessary because we can defend against them. We've never been able to develop the technology to make that a reality. So what's our doctrine for tactical nuclear strikes? Are we going to use our strategic and then risk World War III? Clearly, as Ray mentioned, big question. How are we going to control escalation? So a tactical nuclear is used somewhere in the world. What's the response to that? Bigger and better, more powerful, more damage, more killing, or not? How do we react to that? I'm not sure we have a doctrine for that. Our well-stated nuclear deterrent doctrine is nuclear weapons are primarily for deterrence. We don't want to use them, and therefore we're going to keep them to make sure nobody else tries to use them against us. But what do we do with one of these regional conflicts? How are we going to respond? Arms control, which we did all through the 70s and 80s and into 90s, to early 2000s. We used arms control as one of our national security tools to rein in the risk of nuclear conflict. Is that still going to work? Well, we only have one current treaty that's in effect. That's the New START Treaty. And it had a provision in it that it could be extended by 5 years if both sides agreed to do that. And the Biden administration did do that early off the blocks. But that 5-year ends in 2026. What's going to replace it? We've got a lot of time and effort invested in that treaty because it's the culmination of all the preceding treaties that involve very detailed and negotiated provisions for monitoring, holding the other side accountable, and assuring ourselves that the other side wasn't cheating. That's all at risk. And what are the odds that the US and Russia are in a mood and have a kind of relationship now that could lead to a positive negotiation? Now, keep in mind, 1968, when Kosygin and Johnson met, we were in the height of the Cold War. We weren't exactly buddies with the Soviets at that time. But when there were determinate national security motives for reining in the size of the arsenal, they both stepped up to the plate and over time took baby steps to reduce the risk. What about other nuclear weapon states? Are they likely to join in? UK, France. Well, they'd probably be willing, but remember, they're in the very small inventory of warheads. China is growing, but when we've talked to China in the past, why don't you join us and have a larger arms control negotiation and limit our nuclear warheads? China says, we'd be happy to do that. When you come down to our level, come and talk to us. Now we're going from 1,500 down to 500. Are we willing to do that? North Korea, it wants a deterrent just like Israel does against existential threats, including the United States. We've talked about the Israel-Iran situation, so there we are. Now, we can't forget the non-state actors, which Ray mentioned. That risk is still out there. Some of these non-state actors could be surrogates for nuclear weapons states that don't want to directly get involved in the conflict, but they'll encourage somebody else to do their dirty work for them. Or some of the jihadists or other crazies could just say, we want to do it for our own purposes. So they try to steal a warhead or a bomb or nuclear material. Can you envision what Manhattan would have looked like at 9/11 if there had been nuclear contamination as well as the destruction from the blast of those aircraft and all that fuel? The good news is it hasn't happened. The bad news is it's still out there, it's still a threat, and we need to deal with it. Having said all that, I don't have any good answers for these questions.
But our next speakers do.
Yeah, I think, Neile, we're going to get you online because you're going to help us understand how the U.S. is trying to defend itself against some of this craziness that's out there. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Neile, take it away.
Thanks, Maureen. Good morning, everyone. I'm actually here in Washington, D.C. The sign you see behind me, the Nevada National Security Sites, is the little fine print somewhere on that chart says Washington, D.C. office. So I'm here in D.C. where I spend most of my time and go back and forth. I want to talk to you today about a couple of things. I do want to give you some context. Something I find when I talk to groups outside of my world is it's very confusing. What is this company MSTS? What do they have to do with the site? I want to give you just a tiny bit of context for that. So as you can see, what used to be known as just the Nevada Test Site is today the Nevada National Security Sites with an S. I'm going to explain this on this page here. The name was changed at the request of Senator Reid in 2010, shortly before I joined the NNSA. It's all a terrible mouthful of letters, most of which seem to be the same letter. Senator Reid asked us to change the name of the site as a rather strong nod to the site having a future that was not strictly tied to blowing up nuclear weapons. It was prescient, I would say, because as time has gone by, the site has actually come back to life. It continues to do testing, which I'll explain, but not the type of testing that went on prior to the end of the Cold War. but it tests many other things, including response of teams that might come in after an emergency, after any kind of presence of nuclear material being found somewhere where it shouldn't be. All sorts of things get tested at the Nevada national security sites. If you look at this map here, you'll see that actually at sites, we've added the S about a year ago to recognize that what is actually part of the NNSS is kind of flung across the country. We have facilities not only at what you think of as the test site in Mercury, but we have offices at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in California, at the Sandia Laboratory in Albuquerque, at Los Alamos. We have two pieces of something called the Remote Sensing Laboratory, which I'll get to. One at Joint Base Andrews here in DC, the other one at Nellis in Las Vegas. We operate for the government with the innocuous name of the Special Technologies Laboratory. My colleagues here on the panel would be happy to tell you, as soon as you have a benign name like Special Technologies Laboratory, it's probably indicating a whole lot of things no one is going to ever talk about in public in detail. We also operate a program on Long Island, the Counterterrorism Operations Support, also very much an on-the-ground operational response type of activity. And then, of course, this DC office. So what is a company doing running any of this? These days, I find this talk easier to give because most people I talk to have seen the movie Oppenheimer. And I always refer to the part where everybody winds up at Los Alamos in this, godforsaken place, and they spend as much time there as it takes to come up with a weapon that will actually work. They do all the science and engineering to figure out how to actually harness this energy and make it into something that can be a weapon. And then there's another piece of it where you see the material that goes into that first few weapons being made in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And so the model today for the complex that is in charge of the nuclear stockpile. So you saw a lot of things about weapons and warheads and what we're investing in, but I want to make it clear. The stockpile of weapons since the end of World War II has been, in one form or another, the responsibility of a civilian agency. Originally, the Atomic Energy Commission. You'll remember Robert Downey Jr. being nasty in that movie. He was the head of Lewis Strauss, the head of the Atomic Energy Commission. In 1977, with a little bit of an interim, part of the Atomic Energy Commission became the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the independent regulator of nuclear power, and part of it became the Department of Energy, founded in 1977 with the big word energy in it, but most of what it was and continues to be responsible for is the nuclear stockpile. The other piece of it, the delivery systems, the troops that would be involved in operating that, in actually delivering any of these weapons, of course, is the responsibility of the Department of Defense. But from the beginning, from those scenes that you saw in Los Alamos and Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the model was government-owned, contractor-operated. So Los Alamos, those people working there, they had government clearances. They were not government employees. It was run for the government by the University of California in partnership now with some other companies. It continues to be the University of California. And so many of you have seen the test site and subsequently the NNSS operated for the government by different companies. The Mission Support and Test Services LLC is a joint venture of Honeywell, Jacobs Engineering, and Huntington Ingalls Shipbuilding. You might wonder what a shipbuilder is doing in the middle of Nevada. The answer is nobody runs nuclear safety like the nuclear Navy. So those three companies have a joint venture called Mission Support and Test Services, which exists strictly to carry out the contract to operate the Nevada National Security sites on behalf of the government. And this is the case, not only the nuclear security complex, but the 17 national laboratories that the Department of Energy owns, some of which are science laboratories and other energy source laboratories, all 17 with the exception of one in Morgantown, West Virginia, which is dedicated to research on fossil energy. At every site, there is not only whatever the LLC is that is running that place, there is always a small, relatively speaking, office of government people whose job it is to provide oversight. A little bit murky what that means, oversight. I've been on both the federal side for most of my career and now on the contractor side. I can tell you the hardest thing is defining what oversight means, but they're there mainly to assure that the rules are being followed, that they understand what is being done with the money that the government is paying to achieve the ends that the government has contracted for. So we're going to focus here for the moment on the site, what we call now the site. The reason this site is unique, and unique is an overused word. I'm always interested to hear people who try to qualify it and say uniquer or uniquest. It's unique. It really is unique in the world because of its size, because of its location, because of the ability to secure it, and also to be able to nevertheless use it. So we refer to this as a user site. And what do I mean by that? People come from all over, mostly through the Department of Energy and the NNSA, but not entirely, come there to test things out. They may be testing devices. They may be testing operations. They may be testing response times. But you see here, very large, remote, secure, centrally located. One of my colleagues, who for many years was a Los Alamos shock physicist and did a lot of work over the years at the site, kind of summed it up to me in three things. She said, you can do very large, you can do radiological, and you can do secret in one place, and you can't do that anywhere else. You've heard this morning about what I'm going to call stockpile stewardship. That's what we do today. This is the term that was invented in the 1990s following the end of the Cold War, when a decision was made both by Congress, the appropriators, in terms of the money that was now going to be dedicated or not dedicated to maintaining the U.S. nuclear weapons ability, but also from a policy space where people said, we don't have to focus so much on the size of the stockpile or on advancing the stockpile. After all, the Cold War is over. We're signing agreements to not only limit expansion, but to take the stockpile down. But the idea at the time was we're going to steward the stockpile we have. And that has come to mean different things over the years, of course. But in general, we approach this stockpile and have for the last 30 odd years as science-based stockpile stewardship, which means we don't fully blow up a nuclear weapon anymore. I'm sure everybody in the room knows this. But we do model the explosion in many different ways. And why do we even bother doing that? So there are two things I can tell you that have been essential to maintaining the U.S. deterrent. And that's not only the physical deterrent, but the concept of deterrence. And believe it or not, the foremost one is not actually the weapons. It's all of the people who understand the weapons, know how to analyze their capabilities, and know how to change things should things need to be changed. First and foremost, when the Cold War ended and the approach had to change, and I can tell you that the Congress cut the funding for this by an enormous amount. Close to 50% of the funding went away. It was expected that there would be a peace dividend from the end of the Cold War. But the foresight of people who were running all of this at the time inside the Department of Energy was that the one thing we could not afford to lose was that knowledge base and the experts who understood how this worked. After all, as time goes by, those people and their successors, the younger people who would come on and maybe choose to study nuclear physics, but if there was nothing to do in the nuclear weapons world, they'd go and apply that to something else. And what would happen to Los Alamos Laboratory and all its capabilities, or Livermore Laboratory, et cetera? And so first and foremost, the concern was maintaining that. I want to point one other thing out to you back to the Oppenheimer reference, and that is, as you saw in the movie, and again, most of the people in the room already knew this, nuclear science is a very young science. It pretty much dates from the 1930s. There might be people in the room who were born in the 1930s. It's not that old. So we have to constantly do experimental work to try to better understand what is happening when any aspect of this explosion is taking place. And of course, we have to understand what is happening to the materials in these weapons as they age. As the weapons age, as the materials age. So both of those pieces are what make up stockpile stewardship. The current approach to stockpile stewardship is about to change. Not in a great way, not in the sense that we're going to go back to blowing up full-blown weapons. But what we're going to do in Nevada at the site is build a first of a kind, probably one of a kind capability to be able to understand how these weapons work as they age. So the Enhanced Capabilities for Subcritical Experiments project, which is really a series of projects, the need for it was established in 2014. We are starting to build now 10 years later. So as you can see, the investment is going to exceed $2.8 billion, almost $3 billion. What has been known as U1A, the U1A tunnels complex. U1A is just the designation. Underground 1A was that particular area underground. We're enhancing the tunnel itself to be able to accommodate diagnostic equipment that is being developed by the national laboratories in conjunction with those of us at the site in Nevada. This will give us diagnostic capabilities that just don't exist right now. So you can see this is the future of stockpile stewardship. The thrilling thing for us with this site is this is the place that's happening. After years of people saying, what are we going to do with the test site? We're not blowing up nuclear weapons anymore. What are we going to do with the test site? We're doing it. Understanding that explosion is key to understanding how we maintain a stockpile that is safe, secure, and effective. Does what we want it to do, when we want it, where we want it. Global security is an umbrella term we use for programs that involve understanding not only what we can do to protect ourselves should some state or non-state actor decide to get messy with either an actual conventional weapon or worse, in some cases, nuclear material that's not in a conventional weapon, that's in a device, and it's a non-state actor, and somebody finds something, and now what do we do? So we have all of those programs working at the site and at several of our sites to understand both what might we do about things like that and how would we respond, and also in a big way to understand what are other people doing and how do we know that? If Kim Jong-un says he's exploded a nuclear weapon, do we believe him? How would we know that? Well, we've got technologies being developed in test beds at this site to be able to know what's going on. If Iran is cheating on agreements that they may have made with the international community to not develop a weapon, how do we know that they're actually doing it? This is a concept that has started over the last number of years at the site in Nevada with associated work at the Special Technologies Laboratory in Santa Barbara that uses an approach called test beds. We are using tunnels and locations, above ground and underground locations around the site that many, many years ago were just in service of the stockpile. Today, we are building test beds to simulate environments around the world to understand from data, for example, what is an explosion that is set off in rock? What kinds of signature sounds and reverberations does it give off? If such an explosion was set off in something other than that rock, what would it look like? What would it sound like? What kind of data does it generate? The investment from the Department of Energy in this capability at the site in Nevada is growing by leaps and bounds. 10 years ago, that program overall was about $120 million a year. Congress is now funding that program overall, so it's not all coming to Nevada, at close to $1 billion a year now. A significant amount of that money is coming to build this capability in Nevada. The other piece of this that I wanted to talk about in the context of the theme this morning about capabilities and response in a changing environment is a capability that most people don't even know exists for the US government. We maintain a capability to survey areas, and we do it at all major public events. For example, the Super Bowl in Las Vegas, the presidential inauguration in Washington, all sorts of very large public events around the country. A survey is conducted ahead of the event of background radiation to understand if something happens during the event. Somebody could call in a threat, something could happen on the ground. You would know immediately what's real and what's different about what should be there. We maintain it at Nellis and at Joint Base Andrews here in DC, but I'll tell you that it's connected to the National Nuclear Weapons Laboratories, where the expertise to understand what kind of data might be telling you what resides. The joint aspect of this and how we run it is critical for this kind of capability and defense for the United States. I mentioned the inauguration. I'll tell you that I live in Chevy Chase, Maryland, and prior to the last presidential inauguration, I happened to see one evening in the neighborhood email, people started writing about what are those helicopters going back and forth and back and forth. And I'm not going to tell you it was conspiracy theory, but there was a lot of concern. And it was a rare moment I jumped in and said, I actually know what this is. And here's what it is. They're taking background data. So I explained the whole thing. And someone wrote back and said, that's why I love living in Washington. There's always someone who knows what's actually going on. Here you see advanced search and emergency operations capability, the NEST capability. These are capabilities that have existed for a number of years, but are absolutely dependent on having the technical expertise at hand at the national laboratories and in Nevada that might have gone away at the end of the Cold War if people hadn't started thinking about what else do we need to be doing and how are we going to attract and retain a workforce that has that kind of expertise, because the world is not a static place. Threats change. And so you can see here that we have that capability and we maintain it on behalf of the nation. And we are doing actually more of these kinds of operations than ever. The last thing I'll tell you is, as you can see from this slide, although there were close to 20 years of people trying to figure out now what with the Nevada test site after the end of the Cold War, things have turned around in a major way. People fight for space to come to the site and be able to do what they want to do there. I've been around this since 1987, the entire nuclear complex, and it is stunning to have seen what's gone on in the last 10 years at the Nevada site and continues to go. So that's a good news story from many perspectives. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Neile. We really appreciate that. I really wanted to emphasize this because it shows Nevada being at the forefront of responding to some very critical threats. Tom, please take it away.
Thanks sincerely for the opportunity to be here and especially to escape the Southern Nevada temperatures for a day or two. All the preceding speakers have really given us a lot of food for thought. And Maureen asked me to complement them with thoughts on how what's called nuclear nonproliferation programs might respond to these evolving threats. I'm going to speak from the perspective, for a variety of reasons, as an informed citizen, not as a member of DRI or representing DRI, the Desert Research Institute, or NNSA, or any other entity or agency in any particular form. Although my being informed comes from 34 years at LANL, 5 years at Livermore as NNSA's chief scientist for the U.S. Nuclear Detonation Detection System, 4 years with the Aerospace Corporation trying to figure out how to make that work better, and now a couple of years with the Desert Research Institute trying to foster new ways of thinking about how to go about this business of nonproliferation. From a high level, I'm going to begin by noting that nonproliferation is a distinct part of the prevent element of NNSA's Prevent, Counter, and Respond plan for reducing global nuclear threats. Google will lead you straight to this plan where you can read for it yourself and discover that nonproliferation is effectively preventing would-be proliferant states and terrorists from obtaining nuclear weapons, nuclear or radioactive materials for the purpose of developing nuclear weapons, and then related technologies and expertise. This effort at nonproliferation has been a part of the NNSA mission for a significant period of time and is evidenced through not just the Defense Programs Directorate in NNSA, but something called the Defense Nuclear Nonproliferation Directorate. And traditionally, they have attempted to support this mission through things like materials management and minimization, where we have folks that have gone out around the world to sort of gather up radioactive materials and things like that and bring them back and save them and dispose of them. A program called Global Materials Security. And then finally, on the sort of the policy end, the nonproliferation and arms control element of this directorate. And they work primarily through how we support nonproliferation treaties. Treaties for nonproliferation have literally been in existence since, I want to say, 1963. And nonproliferation treaties are all about monitoring. It is the nature of a nonproliferation treaty that the signatories to that treaty agree to monitor each other for compliance. It's sort of the old trust but verify mantra, if you will. President Kennedy and Chairman Khrushchev would not have signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963, or at least President Kennedy would not have signed it had he not visited what was then Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory and the Sandia Engineering Laboratory and saw the development of sensors to go on satellites for monitoring for the presence of illicit nuclear detonations. So this is an effort that has been around for an awfully long time. Now, monitoring is all about having capabilities for detecting, locating, and characterizing activities that are germane in particular to the weaponization of nuclear energy. And there is a fourth element of this Directorate for Defense Nuclear Nonproliferation that is specifically charged with the research and development of these kinds of capabilities. And Neile mentioned that this is a program that has grown over the years to nearly $1 billion per year of annual funding. So it's not an unsubstantial program at all. And in fact, the office at the NNSA that's responsible for this actually holds something like 90% of the entire US government's funding for these kinds of efforts. So it's an important element for nonproliferation and a real focal point. The challenge here is peaceful versus non-peaceful applications of this technology, just like with any technology. There are great benefits to having nuclear energy, particularly from the perspective of power generation in a world where climate change may be implying that this is going to be one of the important means of generating power and electrical energy in the future. Irregardless of past experiences with this, new advances in reactor technology are now underway, which make it almost impossible to have what happened, for example, at 3 Mile Island in Fukushima. There are fundamentally new approaches to the generation of power through nuclear energy. The challenge here is that just based on US approaches to nuclear weapons, this is an incredibly complex arena. Apologies for the eye chart. You're not meant to read it. Just focus on the number of boxes and the chains and the pathways through this complex array of activities. This summarizes what's involved with the United States approach to the development of nuclear weapons and to their maintenance and to their sustainment and to eventually their dismantlement and disposal. This involves a vast array of activities. They range from materials acquisition and processing to component fabrication, and that means of both nuclear and non-nuclear subsystems, to system assembly, test, and validation. In other words, there are many places to look for the possibility of weaponization going on when it comes to nuclear materials. This is the domain of nuclear nonproliferation. This is the challenge. How do you develop technologies to detect, locate, and characterize, i.e., provide definitive and trustworthy evidence that somebody someplace who has either agreed to not do this or we would prefer not do it is actually involved? All of these kinds of actions rely on foundational competencies held at the DOE and the NNSA's labs, sites, and plants. So that's a big concern that the U.S. nuclear weapons enterprise and the domestic nuclear fuel cycle have significantly narrowed or declined since the Cold War era. This leaves the nation without the large cadre of DOE and NSA lab personnel with hands-on experience in things like sensitive fuel cycle processes and nuclear weapons development and testing. Coupled to that, modern developments in manufacturing like 3D printing, advances in computing like edge processing and now AI, robotics, which give us unmanned autonomous vehicles, not just in the air, not just on the land, but these days on the water and underwater, and other key areas, all combined with generally easier access to nuclear-related information through our now global interconnectivity, are creating more and diverse pathways to developing a nuclear weapon, while also reducing and evolving the footprint and the associated signatures of those activities. It's getting harder and harder all the time because of advances in general technology. So the convergence of these trends, coupled with the continued threat of covert proliferation, is making the task of nuclear nonproliferation more difficult. And recognizing that, this Office of Defense Nuclear Nonproliferation Research and Development, 4-ish, maybe 5-ish years ago, decided to spawn a new program. They initiated something called the Non-Proliferation Stewardship Program. It's somewhat analogous to, and also complementary to, the Nuclear Weapons Stockpile Stewardship Program. From the executive summary of a report to Congress recently on this program, you'll find that through a typical government quadrennial process, this nonproliferation stewardship program is inventorying expertise and technologies and facilities. It's identifying gaps in capabilities and investing in or leveraging existing capabilities with the aim of ensuring that non-proliferation technical competencies will be ready to meet the future of non-proliferation challenges. And notably, a substantial aspect of this non-proliferation stewardship program infrastructure investments is based on developing test beds, pilot production facilities, and research environments of the sort that Neile highlighted in her presentation. And indeed, I'll say a recent study has shown that since 2010, this one office in our government has invested about $1.2 billion in infrastructure and related research out at the site, specifically for this purpose. And this research that's going on is now beginning to evolve in response to considerations for what might be called unilateral arms control. All arms control to date is predicated on cooperative processes. For reasons that Ray and Keith pointed out, we are facing a world where cooperation is breaking down, may have broken down fundamentally. We're not quite sure yet. We'll see. Will there be something beyond New START? What will the nation need for the future when we may have to do arms control from unilateral perspectives, utilizing only assets available to the United States without overt cooperation between other parties, be they allies or adversaries? DNN is sort of branching out. Defense Nuclear Non-Proliferation is sort of branching out, if you will. All of this is happening in a multipolar world. And it's bad enough that it's multipolar, but there's growing isolationist attitudes that have led to this breakdown in cooperative approaches to arms control. And I would claim even more broadly in general challenges to ensuring peaceful uses of technologies from not just nuclear energy, but things like biosciences and now geoengineering. What's geoengineering? Everybody's heard about cloud seeding, generating rain. Check out online references for concerns about geoengineering. You know, it might be nice to generate rainfall over your own territory. What happens in a system as complex as the weather to neighboring territories? Or even worse, what if someone decides that they want to do a little geoengineering to make things difficult for an adversary, and that adversary is us? Now, furthermore, you've got disruptive events, starting with 9/11. Who would have thought that a 747 airliner is just a bladder of fuel for creating fires to melt large building superstructures? Totally different way of thinking than what we were used to. Now, and look at the example of Ukraine, where YouTube is just loaded regularly with updates to how small cadres, and in some cases, even individual members of the Ukrainian army are exploiting drones, small hand-built drones, for the purposes of changing the nature of battlefield warfare. In other words, there are needs for not just enabling innovation, but for fostering what I want to call creative new ways of thinking. You know, innovation is about alternative approaches of existing technologies and things we know. What about new technologies? What about entirely new approaches to thinking? And by this, I mean not just incremental or evolutionary bootstrapping of current capabilities or programs of records. Basically, we need to similarly alter our approaches to non-proliferation. My personal opinion is that we need what I'm going to call agile, adaptive, and responsive approaches to rapid research, development, test, and evaluation of new means for ensuring non-proliferation. We have to think beyond individual experiments and beyond individual test beds for episodic tests or relatively short duration campaigns. I think we need facilities for at-scale and continual validation and verification of new technologies, tools, and models for non-proliferation, while also mentoring and training the next generation of non-proliferation subject matter experts. This involves staff, policies, processes, and associated resources. So there are two things that I like to suggest that we think about in these regards. One is the application of agile, with a capital A, discipline methodologies and tools. These were developed by the software industry, and they're responsible, for example, the likes of Amazon being able to update its entire online presence every 15 seconds. This is not just making minor tweaks and little tiny changes in a piece of software. They're literally, their entire enterprise infrastructure is updated every 15 seconds, continuously, 24/7, 365. The application of these agile methods is also no small factor in the success of SpaceX. We know what they've been up to lately. The second factor to consider is, I think, something that has enabled a number of our basic sciences communities to flourish as their pursuits have increased in complexity. And here I'm going to reference places like laboratories for experimental nuclear and high energy physics, facilities for advanced synchrotron sources for materials development, and national high magnetics research and development. This implies technical leadership and dedicated staff that are continually on site for facilities development as well as operations, and who have a broad range of scientific, technical, and engineering credentials, which place them on a par with folks who want to come in and do the experiments or conduct the campaigns or run the programs. There has to be peer-to-peer, co-equal collaboration as opposed to current approaches, in particular to DNN R&D. I think partnering with industry and universities is also going to be critical, not regarding them as mere consultants or as subcontractors, but as co-equal participants, because experience at these other facilities has shown that the inclusion of universities and industry partners spawns incredible new opportunities. Essentially, what I'm proposing here is a business model for more of a laboratory than as a subcontracted test site. Defense Programs now has Pulse at the site, the premier underground laboratory for subcritical experimentation. I think DNN needs the site and NNSS to be the non-proliferation laboratory because of the nature of what has to be done. What is that nature? You got to have multi-site, red, blue, and white teaming, as well as individual facility usage. You have to incorporate interagency partners and stakeholders using real-time communications, computing, processing, and reporting infrastructure. Some of this is done already for DoD partners and in other elements of counterterrorism, counterproliferation work at the site, but it is not a feature of current defense nuclear nonproliferation approaches. The key here is, I believe, that we have to practice as we need to play in real-world scenarios for proliferation. The world we live in today, the game and the field are changing under our feet as we're trying to practice. And this is going to require new thinking and approaches from the highest levels of the executive government. And lastly, I'll say that while DNN needs are in many ways derived from and compatible with DP needs, I think DNN needs in certain aspects of scope and temporal considerations actually transcend what the stockpile stewardship program is aimed to provide. And this becomes large a result of the fact that the nonproliferation stewardship program includes consideration of means to deployment of its product, while for stockpile stewardship, deploying those products is somebody else's game, like Department of Defense, if you will. Given current challenges to the existing nuclear weapon programs of record, from needs for redressing loss of capacities in multiple elements of the enterprise, I think establishing the sort of venue that I'm suggesting here for creative and innovative approaches to nonproliferation, research, development, test, and evaluation could stimulate discoveries, ways of thinking, and approaches to validation and verification, and maybe even pilot demonstrations that can help meet defense programs as well as DNN needs. DNN, in many respects, was born out of leverage of defense programs, facilities, and personnel. I think the world has turned around a little bit now, and present challenges that have resulted in where we are now suggest that if we had this sort of an approach to defense nuclear nonproliferation, it might in fact gestate future means for defense programs to leverage defense nuclear nonproliferation instead of the other way around. So I'm an optimist, and I believe that where there's a will, there's a way. The question is, will we have a government with a will for DNN? With that, I'll stop.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom. So I hope you got a little perspective. You got really scary threats, and the world is changing, and nuclear weapons may be something that do get used in our lifetime, where many of us thought we'd never see that. But you also get a perspective, and you can go tell your neighbors and your friends and your family that Nevada's got this. We're working on this. There are resources that are being looked at both on the deterrence perspective and on the nonproliferation perspective. And we're at the forefront of really looking at the solution set. So it's not just all doom and gloom. Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again soon.